The night the town stopped feeling like a town anymore. The kitchen smelled of onions frying and something metallic, like a coin left too long in the sun. Ethan stood on a chair at the counter, knees tucked under him, humming the same two notes he'd been humming all week. He hummed without words, a little stutter of melody that lived like a pebble in my pocket. A note, a pause, another note. He was 4, and his hum was harmless, a small engine that kept him busy while I rinsed plates and watched steam ghost up to the exhaust fan. We were halfway through the rhythm of our life. The bleached silver sink, the dog folded in an old blanket by the back door, the slow evening light laying like honey on the table, when the phone buzzed on the counter. The message came in 3 lines from the school system. Lockdown in effect. Secure doors. Await further instructions. By the time I read the last line, the hum in the kitchen seemed to fall in with something else, an announcement I could not yet hear. I dropped a plate. The crash sounded like a punctuation mark in the moonlit room. Ethan scrambled down as if the sound belonged to an adult conversation he was too small for. I told him it was nothing. Then, because nothing is a lie you tell to cover a doubt, I told him to put his shoes on. We moved through our ritual, coat over shoulders, the small hand in mine. Only now the world beyond our porch light felt folded inward, like a map that had been refolded badly. Cars moved slow. The radio traffic report stuttered. On the way to the school, the siren felt distant and precise, drawing a line that we were not meant to cross. The school had a look to it that night I could not name at first. It was the ordinary building made suddenly small by its own silence. Classrooms that usually sang with the shuffling of papers and the tired friendliness of janitors were sealed into cubes of air. In the front office, a whiteboard carried marker smudges, announcements about field trips and permission slips. Handwritten, the principal's line, "Stay calm, follow protocol." Every adult's hands moved in small, practical gestures, while their faces remained stubbornly blank, as if expression had been taxed beyond resource. They took our names at the table. A woman I'd only seen in the 2nd grade pickup line recited my full name like it was an inventory item. I signed a sheet with my home number, Ethan's allergies, the neighbor to call if I didn't answer. A thin man with a tired badge offered me a paper cup of water and did not make eye contact. They asked no one what they knew. There were protocols for that. And yet, their eyes kept sliding toward the long corridor that led down to the music room, the gym, the hexagonal bank of windows that faced the playground. Inside, through the glass, the children were small, dark lumps, motion hidden by the geometry of closed doors. Some of them hummed. Some of them were silent as mice. That evening began the things I still cannot explain, so that you can fold them away like a parable. It began with a tune that belonged to the wrong place, something like a nursery rhyme, but with a cadence bent as if someone had pressed their thumb against the record. It began with a man who was supposed to be one of many, an anonymous janitor who kept the building honest and swept its secrets under rug, and who whistled a melody I would later find lodged behind my ears at 3 in the morning, waiting like a person on my doorstep. 1. The janitor's tune. When the lockdown alarms first went off, the public address system became a throat that spoke thinly. A voice that sounded like it belonged to the machine itself announced, clipped, "Identify the threat. Stay where you are. Do not approach doors. Do not," then a pop and a whisper, as if the speaker had been dipped in tissue paper and sucked dry. Later, a transcript would be handed around, printed and stamped, an artifact of bureaucratic response. It read, "PA, attention, lockdown initiated. Teachers, secure, static, doors. Children, remain, garbled, in place. If you are hearing this and are not in the building, do not come. Repeat, do not," thin whistling. The whistling threaded between the words like a seamstress pulling thread. It started high and bright, then it folded into itself. Hush, hush, something seemed to hum, not in voice, but in the residual cold of the speakers. In the footage later reviewed by people who had to be shown things in order to believe them, the janitor appears where janitors always appeared, by the far door, keys on a ring, a cart with bottles and a green mop bucket. He wore a standard-issue mask for dust, nothing out of the ordinary, except that every time the camera passed him, his chest would tilt with that tune. He whistled low to himself while he worked, and for a while, everyone thought it was a nervous tic, the kind of thing a man does to keep a rhythm while the fluorescent lights pulse. The footage is ordinary until the building's camera angle crosses to the north wing. The janitor pushes a cart across the frame. He pauses beside the trophy case, turns the head toward the music room as if listening. The PA hisses. The sentence stutters into the whistling. The janitor's mouth forms the shape of what would be the words, but the sound that comes from the speakers fills the air instead. On the timestamp, 1 minute and 23 seconds later, the janitor keeps walking. But the frame cuts to a still that lasts a breath too long. When the next frame returns, the cart is empty. The mop lies on the floor with no one holding it. A colleague who watched that footage with me later insisted the janitor did not leave. He said he stood with his back to the wall until someone went to check. Then he said something he could not prove, that the janitor had been whistling the whole time, until he wasn't. It is a small difference in the way stories are told, but a large one in what it suggests. Things that stop whistling do not always come back to their tune. At home, the tune found me like a cousin at a funeral. My coffee maker began to stutter in the early hours, the drip taking on the rhythm of the song. The baby monitor picked up a thin noise that matched the second note of Ethan's hum. We taped the monitor to the bookshelf so it was closer to the lamp. At night, the refrigerator would kick and the compressor would sigh in a way that harmonized with the whistling until sleep felt like an uneasy chorus. Once, while making dinner weeks later, I looked up and realized I knew the melody in a new register. The whistle inverted its intervals, and suddenly a lullaby I'd sung as a child sounded like a secret message. I woke Ethan with a kiss and found him humming that same inverted tune, eyes heavy but a smile climbing his face as though it belonged to someone who had heard the wrong answer to a math problem and found it delightful. Teachers began to talk about it, small, private confessions traded during staff room coffee breaks. Mrs. Alvarez, who taught 3rd grade, said she had heard the whistling come from the vent above her classroom, and that when she went to the door to see where it was coming from, it stopped. She told us she remembered walking to the janitor's closet and seeing the mop bucket still in its place, the janitor's jacket hanging on the hook. She told us how the hair at the back of her neck stood up as if there had been a cold hand behind her ear. She told us how the PA repeated "hush" 3 times like a child being tucked in. The staff room agreed that being told to stay calm is a strange way to request that you forget to be frightened. On the community forum, someone named Mabel Mama posted a short note. "Anyone else hearing that whistling? My kid keeps singing it in his sleep." Superintendent Kevin replied with a longer official message about keeping children safe and reminding parents that the school would hold an informational meeting the next morning. The school's security officer posted a blurred still from the hallway camera with a timestamp, along with the caption, "We're reviewing. Please don't speculate." A parent commented, "Please tell me this is nothing." Another wrote, less pleading, more fierce, "Lock down our children if you must, but tell us who is in our schools." There were rumors that spread like the smell of frying onions at a school bake sale. One said the janitor had once been a musician and that this was simply his way of soothing children during late-night events. Another said that the tune was a bug in the PA system, an echo caused by a loop in the wiring. A few whispered that the janitor had been in the building longer than most teachers remembered, that he had been there before the school was a school, that his family had lived just across the street and his voice belonged to the memory of the building. People liked stories that placed the uncanny within the realm of the explainable. A janitor who played music makes for a neat parable. A janitor who vanishes leaves a hole that invites things to crawl in. The janitor did not vanish in the sense the tabloid wanted. He was found the next morning in the parking lot, as if he had been there the whole time. He said he had been walking his route, checking the cars, making sure the perimeter was secure. He told the police that he had whistled to keep his steps even, and that the tape on the PA had started making noise. He held up his hands when asked to reproduce the tune, and the sound that came from his mouth was wrong, an imitation of something the tape had done to him. His eyes darted in the interview footage like a small animal seeking an exit. In the statement he gave later to a detective, he wrote, "I can't explain why I walked so far away. I thought I was still sweeping." We were given an explanation because we asked for one, and we were given the kind of explanation institutions can provide: partial, incomplete, insistently reasonable. They said the footage had glitches, that during the lock they had to reroute signals, that the janitor could have left to his car for air. Someone said we should listen to the radios and rest on the logic that things that can be measured are safe to live with. But the tune kept returning in small, private ways. A wind chime at Mrs. Connolly's window that chimed the melody when the wind came precisely from the east. A neighbor's Bluetooth speaker catching the strain of it while streaming white noise at 2 a.m. It seeped into the edges of our evenings. At one point, I made a small, absurd ritual. I took a strip of painter's tape and stuck it to the underside of Ethan's nightlight. The tape hit a seam, nothing more. I told myself the tape buffered the light from some interference. The next night, Ethan's hum shivered with a new air. He padded into my room, sat on the bed, placed his small hand over mine, and said, "There's someone singing the other song." He did not mean it as a metaphor. He looked at me, earnest, unafraid, and when I asked where the song was coming from, he pointed at the hallway, to the curtained glass of the front door that reflected the streetlight. There, in the cool rectangle of glass, the whistling folded over itself and was almost, but not quite, right. People needed a shape for the thing that whistled. We tried to shape it. We compared it to radio static and to cousins passing down lullabies in the wrong key. We blamed PA wiring. We blamed stress. We blamed absent fathers who died at sea and left a siren in the house that could not drown itself. None of these answers satisfied in the space where flesh meets instinct. That space is a small geography where the word mother is heavier than a coat and where a child's small silence can rearrange the furniture of your mind. I walked the halls that night because walking is a thing to do when your hands cannot fix a problem with your voice. I walked past the music room where the chairs were pushed under tables and the drum kit was still. The janitor's cart stood by the mop closet, untouched. In the doorway, there was a smear of small handprints, not dirty so much as smudged with something like the residue of breath. The custodian's mop lay on its side, the fiber splayed like a small, exhausted creature. When I bent to pick up the handle, a childish, protective compulsion to restore order, the handle did not feel like a handle. It felt cool, as if someone else had been gripping it a minute before and had, in the movement away, left a memory of pressure. I do not know if the janitor had something to do with the music. I know only that for a while after that night, every appliance seemed to carry a memory of him. The kettle sang in the wrong register. My phone would buzz, and the vibration would sound like a tiny whistle. The world rearranged its noises so that the tune nested itself in the quotidian. That is the worst kind of haunting. Not a grand apparition, but the slow colonization of ordinary sounds. The way a weed creeps under a fence and, without fanfare, becomes part of the garden. If this is the sort of story that folds you into late hours, and if that hum has already begun to move behind your teeth, then stay with me now. There are things that make more sense when held together. when we keep turning them in our hands like small opaque stones. Consider subscribing if the kind of quiet that keeps you listening is what you want to come back to. I ask because this is a place where people collect their fears and set them down like coats. We return to button them up when the wind gets cold. 2. The mirror room. By the time the mirror room became a problem to be guarded, I had learned that schools hide their most vulnerable spaces in plain sight. The theater's dressing room, long mirrors framed in yellow bulbs, the kind of place small actors make promises to themselves in, was designed for rehearsal and light. It was also a place children lined up their shoes, like stone figures leaving markers of their passage. On the day the mirror room turned, the shoes were arranged in a slow, obedient arc, toes pointing at reflections as if they were about to be called forward. The first report came from Miss Patel, a music teacher with hands always dusted in sheet music. She said the mirrors looked wrong when she first stepped in. The reflections lagged behind movements. A child reached for his elbow and saw in the glass a hand move a fraction of a second later. A teacher waved, and the glass offered back a stubbornly delayed mimic, like a DVD that had fallen a frame behind its own life. She described a tug, a pressure, as though the reflections were curious and reaching with one half of themselves to touch the world. You have to understand that when children are ushered into a lockdown, their minds want to make the situation legible. Children inherit patterns, counting to 10 under the desk, pressing palms to knees, but when a reflection begins to answer a second late, the pattern it offers is not the one they learned in drills. They bring superstition like a toy. A line of shoes before a mirror becomes a congregation. When Laya was taken to the nurse, she did not have a bruise or a fever. She had been humming a wrong lullaby and kept touching the glass as though to reassure herself it was indeed glass and not a window to a person kneeling behind it. Her mother later told me Laya had always watched faces as if she were learning how to read. She once made a list of the faces in our town, the baker, the woman with the white dog, the crossing guard, and could point them out at 3 blocks distance. In the nurse's office, Laya sat on the cot with a pencil clenched in her fist. She traced small circles on the paper, wound forms the nurse kept in a folder. She hummed the tune the janitor had whistled, but she placed an extra small syllable in the middle that made the song look like a question. The nurse's note read, "Patient curious about reflections, reports someone else in the mirror. Calmed after tape applied to mirror, referred to parent and counselor." That line, tape applied to mirror, became a community ritual, similar to my strip of tape on Ethan's nightlight. Teachers started to carry rolls of painter's tape in their pockets. If a child insisted on touching the glass, they would let them press a fingertip to the adhesive and then peel it away, satisfying the small compulsion without letting the reflection be a full interaction. Children learned to press palms to their own chests when their hands began to wander toward the reflective surfaces. We taught them to say, "Not tonight," soft and firm, as if it were a password. One afternoon, I walked through the wing where the theater's dressing rooms were housed. The mirrors were all covered with butcher paper, the cheap brown rectangles stapled across the glass like flags of surrender. Under one of the coverings, a small shoe had been left, single and patient. Someone, perhaps the child's parent or a janitor, had placed a note beside it. Found by the mirror. Child okay. The note was half apology, half artifact. It looked like something found in the middle of deciding what to do. Teachers reported tactile experiences that were difficult to articulate because their vocabulary belonged to the ordinary. A hand meeting a pressure that pushed back, a wrist that slid against a surface with the resistance of a membrane. Mr. Hahn, who teaches drama, pressed his palm to the glass of the mirror and said he felt the hollow of a second hand on the other side. He told us it was like touching a breath held underwater. He laughed afterward, but his laughter was thin. He took to sleeping with the light on in his classroom and would not stand facing the mirror any longer. Small children relayed tales that were half dream, half report. Jamie, who would later be found on the merry-go-round, told a story about a girl in the mirror who would not smile properly and whose head tilted at the wrong angle. Mateo, a name that would fill headlines later on, but for now belonged to an ordinary child in a town that had not yet learned how to be cautionary, drew pictures of faces that had holes where their eyes should be, but with perfect smiles. I kept these drawings in my phone, childlike, sad, insistently bright. The teacher who found Laya first said the child had tried to swap a sticker with her reflection. She held up a yellow smiley face, presented it to the glass, and the girl across the way, her twin in the mirror, shrugged and held up a badly torn one in exchange. Miss Patel said she saw the confusion in the children's faces when the glass did not behave as mirrors are supposed to. Children expect mirrors to teach them their own honesty. Mirrors are small confessors, telling you the angles of your face back so you can practice being the person you'll be when no one is watching. When the mirror begins to answer back with an acceptance of a different answer, the child has to reconcile two truths at once. A line of shoes, a child offering a sticker to the glass, these are not the stuff of monstrous violence so much as the slow disintegration of trust. The mirror asks a question in gestures and mimicking, and children's answers are literal. They offer their stickers, their buttons, their voices. In the nurse's office, Laya kept whispering, "It wants faces. It wants faces," she said, and looked at me as if to say, "Mama, that's not a metaphor." We clipped the tape around mirrors with care. The painter's plastic framed a new architecture in the school. Mirrors muted into rectangles of pale brown, the lights above them dimmed to a hum. A pastor who drove a van, a man who liked to bring fruit to the staff room on Mondays, came around one afternoon with a handful of laminated prayers and suggestions. Cover the glass, let light be constant, teach the children a new rhyme. He read into a loudspeaker a series of humble lines. For the children, shelter. For the mirror, stillness. People took the booklets and folded them into pockets as if holding a talisman. There was one incident the press did not like to highlight because it was not violent in a way editors thought would sell. A teacher, young, wore her hair in a braid, stood before a mirror with a child who kept insisting that the reflection wanted to walk out of the glass. The teacher lifted the child's chin and taught her a response. "Not you, not tonight. Say it," the teacher said, "not like a command, but like a hinge in your jaw." The child said it, and the mirror slowed. The mirror's lag softened. The teacher swore later she had felt something like disappointment pass through the glass when the phrase failed to open. These small domestic details of defense, tape, laminated prayers, practiced phrases, are easy to forget in the heat of retelling. We are more interested in the big dramatic moments, the vanishing, the heroism. But the thing that keeps a town from unraveling is rarely a single dramatic act. It is the thousand small, patient motions of people learning a new grammar. I learned to fold my hands in my lap in a certain way when I walked past mirrors in public places. I cupped my phone so its back could not reflect the world. If I walked by a store window and saw movement that matched me a breath late, my first impulse was to slow my walk, to drag out my shadow until the air aligned. The mirror room, sealed with craft paper and tape, carried an odor like old glue and stage makeup. When I put my palms to the brown paper, I felt small, embalmed warmth, the ghost of 100 little hands. I tapped the paper lightly and heard the hollow sound the builders knew. Ethan reached up and traced a circle on the cover with a sticky finger. He whispered to me, as if making a negotiation, "If the mirror is tired, maybe it needs to sleep." He is 4 and makes sense by a logic I admire for its economy. From the hallway, through the taped windows, I could see Miss Patel sitting on a folding chair with a thermos and a legal pad. She watched the papered mirrors and wrote something down. Later, she would say that the mirrors were breathing wrong. Not the soft open of breath after running, but the tight, fast breath of a person who is learning to pretend they are not scared. She would find herself watching reflections in the windows across town, the bank, the grocery store, and realizing the lag had begun to spread in minutes like a rumor. Soon after, parents began to send pictures. A frame from the security camera with a child's hand pressed flat to the glass, the reflection's hand a half beat late. A photo of the dressing room with a single line of shoes laid in an arc. The note beside it in a shaky hand that read, "He said someone waved back." The captions varied. "My kid is okay. My kid can't stop humming. Does anyone know what to do?" The forum filled with people attempting to triangulate the phenomenon with reasons. Old wiring, peer contagion, the emotional loading of pandemic times. Every plausible cause made sense until you walked into a dressing room and felt the glass answering you on its own timetable. It is in these small, rounded moments that the uncanny becomes a household neighbor. You learn to speak in code with someone because you are ashamed of the shape of your fear. You tuck taping of mirrors into the same list as laundry and wills. You make a hand sign at school drop-off that says, "Keep them safe." You teach a child to say, "Not you, not tonight," and you say it again at home, under your breath, until the words themselves become a lullaby from mothers who cannot do anything more dramatic than keep their children close. The next morning, I found a screenshot pushed into my messages, a still from a parent's phone, captured in the dressing room before the mirrors were papered. In the picture, a child stands with a backpack on, and in the glass behind him, the faintest possibility of a second child, only it has no backpack and its eyes are a half step to the right. The caption under the image read, "Spooky. Anyone know what this is?" The replies ranged from sympathetic to defensive to cruel. Someone wrote, "Maybe it's a camera trick." Someone else wrote, "Maybe it's the reflection of the person taking the photo." And another said, "Don't make this worse. We are tired." When you collect enough images and enough testimonies, patterns begin to look inevitable, as if stitched together by a seamstress working too fast. The janitor's tune, the lagging reflections, the shoes lined like pilgrims, each becomes a shard that another person can hold up to the light and say, "See? This is not a single moment, but a texture." But the trouble with texture is that it resists being pinned down without losing what made it uncomfortable in the first place. Once you name the thing, you tame it. Once you tame it, something essential goes missing. I carried a printed copy of the hallway footage home in my bag for the comfort of holding it. I found that I could not stop looking at the part where the janitor had been. There was a loop, a small smear in the image where something had altered the light. I sat at my kitchen table with the printout while Ethan played with his trains and tried to reason like an adult who reads reports for a living. My reasoning had to do with pressure, systems under strain bending things into patterns. My heart, however, held a catalog of small gestures that would not reconcile with reason. The way my son pressed his palm to the glass and watched it as if waiting back. We were learning ways of living around the uncanny as other people learn to live with temperate climates. You bring a sweater, you learn to plan your walks around sudden rains. We brought tape and taught phrases and named doorways as boundaries. We made lists of things to do if a reflection answered back. The lists were small and practical. Cover mirrors, keep lights on, assemble children in groups, refuse solitary contact with reflective surfaces. They were the kinds of lists you make at the bottom of a page and fold into your wallet like a prayer. Then, a week after the first lockdown night, something happened on the playground that made the pattern we were building look like a wheel rolling toward a central pin. The merry-go-round, an old one with chipped paint and grease-darkened handles, began to spin on its own. 3. The merry-go-round. The merry-go-round had been at the center of our summer concerts and scraped knee games for longer than any of us had been sane enough to remember. A blunt disc of metal, paint gone to moss in places, handles dented with the palms of children who used it like a private universe. It lives in the memory as something you push at a park, not a thing of menace. That is part of why what happened felt like betrayal in slow motion. You expect drama at the edges of things you don't trust. You do not expect the thing you trusted to turn its back on you. I was called to the playground at dusk because that was how these things escalated in Maplewood. Someone saw, someone snapped a photo, someone else called. A cluster of parents had gathered under the sodium light that throws everyone into a soft orange shame. The teachers stood with clipboards as if their paper could catch the falling edge of disbelief. A circle of car headlights carved a stage. Jaime sat on the merry-go-round with his legs folded under him like a monk, hands palmed down on the metal as if in prayer, eyes open and very far away. The carousel was spinning. Not the slow push of an exuberant child, not the help from a parent with a long arm. It spun with a velocity that threw the oiled paint into a hum and made the air taste thin. There was no one applying force. You could see the grass flatten in concentric bows around it. A dog's ears lifted and trembled. Someone shouted, and the sound bent against the metal and came back soft. Jaime's hair whipped in a crown, and his lips moved as if he were mapping a shore in the palm of his mouth. He had been at a window earlier in the gym, watching the clouds argue like two old men. How does a boy go from cloud watching to being the center of a spinning disc without anyone touching it? I knelt at the edge, and the motion made my stomach want to substitute other things for gravity. I could taste the iron of the equipment shed door on my tongue, vivid, immediate, ridiculous, but it anchored me to something real. Jaime described the world beyond the merry-go-round as a spiral. He said the horizon had folded into the center like a clock unwinding in on itself. He told his mother, later, that he had been listening to the tune, the same wrong lullaby, and that the playground's motion had matched the rhythm in his head. When they finally pried his fingers from the metal, the skin around his knuckles was white and puckered, a map of pressure and patience. I held him after. He was lighter than I expected, small and damp with sweat, and when I asked what he saw, he pointed to the sky and spoke in the artless logic of children. It was moving the sky, Mama. It was reading the sky wrong. Jaime's older sister swore he had been smiling like someone who had learned a joke and was not going to tell anyone. There were practical things to do. The police taped off the playground and took statements with the gentle brutality of required procedure. Someone from maintenance later said the center bolt of the merry-go-round had been loosened, but the motion was not consistent with a simple mechanical failure. The disc rotated as if animated by a consistent internal wind. A parent with a job that involved charts wrote that the spin's angular speed did not match the torque they could account for. Another father muttered about magnetism and buried his face in an engineering textbook on his phone until the battery died. There was a photograph that did the rounds. Grainy, shot at twilight, the merry-go-round a blurred aureole against the dark grass. In the center, where you would expect a child's face, there is instead a smear that somehow reads as an expression, as though the lens had attempted to capture motion and captured instead a mood. People posted the image with the simple caption, "We found Jaime." The replies folded into themselves. "Are you okay? What did he say?" Someone wrote, "Close your windows." Someone else wrote, "This is silly. My kid is fine." The argument of realism versus terror is how we make ourselves feel better. A teacher, later, said she had felt the air pulse in patterns as she took attendance on the field. A breath, 2 breaths, a small percussion that matched the counting out rhyme children use to choose teams. That rhythm, so often the instrument of games and the lullaby of play, had been appropriated into something else, an engine that regulated motion without hands. The merry-go-round, a machine of conviviality, had become an orb of compulsion. When I think of that spinning disc, I see the way light bent off the handles in streaks, like a signature someone had left with a compass. I think of the thin laugh that floated on the air. Always the same sound people described, a prickle of small teeth and a breath, neither male nor female, just something that liked the shape of a child's joy and leaned into it. The laugh had become a punctuation mark in the town's evenings, an audible punctuation that edged our thoughts with unease. For a day, we convinced ourselves the risk was contained to the playground. We closed the park at sunset, fenced the circle in caution tape, and explained to children that sometimes swings need to rest. But children are honest witnesses. They do not believe in tidy, adult-sanctioned boundaries when the world behaves differently. Jaime still closed his eyes sometimes and hummed the wrong lullaby. He refused to run in circles. He refused to put his backpack down near the merry-go-round for a week. An older woman named Helen, who taught kindergarten for 30 years, insisted that some playground thing had long memory. Everything remembers what used to happen here, she told me, slow and deliberate. We make a hill by walking it 1,000 times. Some motions get a taste for themselves. Her voice was not mystical. It was an old woman's catalog of cause and effect. She peeled an apple in a single continuous string while she talked about how places keep the impressions of generations. It was the kind of explanation that is tidy in a kitchen and offers no respite when you walk into a dressing room and find the mirror answering back. In the days after the merry-go-round incident, small acts of protest clustered like barnacles. Kids were fined lightly by their teachers for running in circles in hallways. Someone drew circles on sidewalk chalk and crossed them out. A parent posted a caution to the community group: "Do not let your children play on metal equipment until we know more." Superintendent Kevin posted statistics: number of children accounted for, number of staff on duty, brief reassurances. And beneath his message, another parent commented with a photo of a toy carousel in a child's room, captioned, "He won't play with it anymore." There was one image that stayed with me above others. A child's sneaker lodged in the grass at an angle, as if someone had set down a foot and then not finished the step. In the picture taken from the nearby school window, you could see the boy's profile through the glass, mouth open as if to speak, and opposite him, a blur the camera could not render into wages of meaning. I kept that photo in my pocket for a week, thumb within the crease as if touch could somehow lend the image sturdiness. Before long, people began to trace lines between incidents, the whistling, the lagging mirrors, the spinning disc, and look for a coherent map. Linkages are a comfort. They allow you to draw routes through uncertainty and say, here is where things connect. But the pattern resisted easy drawings. The merry-go-round suggested motion, the mirror suggested reflection, the tune suggested voice. The only map these made, perhaps, was the map of a child's world being tenderly, slowly rearranged. On late walks home, I would sometimes pass the empty playground and stand in the halo of sodium light and listen for the profile of the laugh. I taught myself to name it without saying the name out loud, the wrongness that liked children's rhythms. I would hum Ethan's 2 notes like a prayer in the dark and feel grateful the song in his mouth was still child-sized. 4. The gym pattern. The gym is a hall of geometry for kids. Black lines for basketball, red circles for warm-ups, the painted big A that swallows sneakers like a mouth. It is a place designed for movement, for bodies to meet at angles and practice the polite collision of adolescence. When we first noticed the pattern on the gym floor, it read like someone had come in at night with a carpenter's compass and decided to make art out of our margin. Concentric circles, drawn with the precise calm of a handed-off pencil, sprawled out from the center like ripples stopped mid-fall. This is the sort of detail that the reports love: neat, plottable, easy to photograph at 4 in the morning. Security footage from that night shows a shadow, or nothing that can be distinguished from shadow, moving over the gym doors at 3 a.m. The superintendent's emailed bulletin, clean, corporate, unpeopled, contained a scanned image of the floor with a caption: "Pattern noted. Custodial team informed." The custodial team, when they spoke with me in the cafeteria, were embarrassed. They had assumed some teenager with a fetish for geometry had come in and used floor polish to compose their master's degree thesis. But the circles were not made with polish. They were etched into the hardwood's finish, slight abrasions that felt like someone had taken a fingernail and drawn rings in a wet varnish, rings that did not correspond to the usual eccentricities of teenage mischief. There were tiny scuffs between the arcs, shoe prints that suggested a small bare foot. The scuffs shadowed the bearing of a child's tread, but ended abruptly at the outermost circle, as if a child's step had been taken and then forgiven. The oddest thing about the gem pattern was how the arithmetic of it appeared to line up with other events we had cataloged. The pulses between rings matched, roughly, the beats in the whistled song. The intervals between wear marks matched the cadence a teacher had told me she felt when she counted students in line. If you were the sort of person who needed linkage, you could start to diagram correspondences. Circle equals rhythm equals mimic. If you were the sort of person who needed a culprit, you could say someone was practicing an aesthetic bent with a child's footprint. Those arguments soaked up the oxygen in meeting rooms. There was a child missing that day, a small hold in our roster. A third-grade student named Luis had been present at morning roll call and then absent at lunch. The class had been assembled by groups for a read-aloud. Someone later said that Luis had been sitting quietly with a dinosaur in his lap, and then, when the teacher's back was turned for a moment, the chair near him was empty. The teacher blinked, said she must have looked away for a breath, and when she turned back, he was gone. The missing child report is a genre, and any genre has its cliches. Police are efficient and polite and take your statement as if you are describing the logistics of a lost parcel. They ask about the home environment, they ask about friends, they ask for phone numbers, they give you a case number that acts as the first seam of hope. They canvassed the school and the playground and questioned the janitor, again, and pulled the footage. The footage showed the gem pattern appearing like a bloom under the camera, concentric and patient, and in its center, a child's imprint. And then, later, nothing but the shadow of where the child's shoulder had rested. We found Louis 3 blocks away at the edge of the river path, asleep on a bench with his shoes neatly aligned beside him, his sweatshirt zipped to the chin, his wrist wet where someone had poured water down his sleeve, as if he were an object to be inventoried and then laid gently on a shelf. He could not tell us how he got there. He recited a list of colors when questioned, enumerating orange, gray, the bitter tint of penny metal, and then he hummed the tune and went quiet. He had a single scratch on his wrist and a smear of something that looked like ash on his knee. The presence of mundane stains gives us something to explain. Ask any parent and they will tell you about cosmic logic. Dirt has agency, water has memory. But these were small, believable things that failed to account for the whole. There was also a report from a volunteer coach who said he had seen a figure near the big exit doors, flattened like shadow on shadow. He described a person wearing a mask in some of the witness statements, a plain white mask with an expression blank as a ledger. We were warned in the press to take witness accounts lightly. Memory is a sieve, rumor an accelerant. Yet multiple people reported the masked figure, coursing the hallways, tapping at glass, standing with pressed palms on windows while school lights glowed on their backs like plate glass. The mask reappeared in the nights when metal met motion, in the gym, the cafeteria, the glass-fronted library. That masked figure began to appear in parent emails titled "With Concern" and in coffee shop conversations that drifted from gossip into something like prayer. We hung on to details because they made us feel active. We collected them like shells, arranging them by size and tone. A parent forwarded a security snapshot of 2 hands on the library window, one small, one masked, and wrote, "Who could that be?" Superintendent Kevin answered in a bulletin about vigilance and the increased presence of security staff. The staff's faces became more drawn with each night of aperture, and detail we ordered extra locks. We asked parents to avoid spontaneously coming to the school during a lockdown. The list grows like a knot. There were tactile metaphors people reached for. A counselor said the gem pattern resembled obsessive rituals, circles performed in order to keep a space centered. A police psychologist suggested mimicry as a social contagion, children telling one another about strange things until their imagination congealed into shared reality. An online commentator wrote that our town had made its own ghost out of pandemic fatigue and fear, bundled up like a domestic animal. The police augmented their presence with a flattened bureaucratic kindness. They placed their cards under parents' doors and patrolled the perimeter with flashlights that made everyone walk more carefully, as if our steps might offend the lights. At one meeting, the detective in charge of the case set a thick folder on the table and slid out a page of transcript. It read like a script for how adults process the odd. Detective, when did you first notice the pattern? Custodian, after we'd locked up. I came back for something. Didn't look right in the morning. Teacher, he was gone when we did math. Sat at his desk and then gone. Parent, we found him down by the river. Didn't cry, just hummed. Detective, any previous incidents? Various. Mirrors, whistling, a merry-go-round. The detective, a man with patient eyes, closed the folder and said the right things. Reassurances about protocol, promises to check footage, referrals to a child services worker if necessary. He could offer no explanation, only the sorts of ordered actions that make a town feel like someone is trying to be useful. Utility is a salve for fear because it transforms worry into tasks and tasks into schedules. At home, I began to catalog small signs that mapped onto the gym's rings. Ethan would trace circles with a crayon and stop before completing them, opting instead to press his thumb into the curve like a seal. He refused to stand in the center of a circle on the floor if one was chalked there for games. He took to wearing the same shoes every day for a nervous comfort, and when asked why, his reply was simple and fatal. They are my good shoes, as though their goodness was a spell. In town conversations, people compared the pattern to ritual. They warned not to stand in concentric forms and to avoid making small acts into big ones by speaking them aloud. We traded a list of do's and don'ts almost as if forming law. Do keep lights on. Don't make a single child walk alone. Do tape mirrors. Don't let children play on unsupervised equipment. These rules were provisional and desperate, the sort of clauses people invent when the contract with reality slips a margin. 5. The nurse's office and Mateo. By the time Mateo disappeared, we had a taxonomy of small, strange losses. Short absences, a glazed stare at a playground, a skin of music left in the corners of our rooms. We had rituals that looked like ceremony, tape, suppressive phrases, constant light, and we had an institutional vocabulary, lockdown procedures, grounds checks, case numbers. But language is always insufficient in the face of what feels like a thing learning to imitate us. Mateo was a child with a laugh like a bell and a mother who brought him zucchini muffins on rainy mornings. He loved building towers out of blocks in the library and would sometimes fall asleep leaning on the spines of picture books like he was being propped by stories. The morning he failed to appear for dismissal, the world did not at first notice. Children slip and wander, teachers miscount. The first alarm was practical. Where is Mateo? The search began procedural and polite. Classrooms were calmed, playgrounds checked, the river path walked by teams with flashlights. A neighbor called to say she had seen a small shadow pass under her porch at midnight. A dog had been found with a sock in its mouth, and the sock bore a smear of chalk. These are the little ingredients adults run to when trying to make sense. Socks, chalk, shadows. We want to give the world chores to do so it behaves. After 18 hours, Mateo returned 3 blocks away, sitting on a stoop outside a house with its porch light stubbornly lit, singing a note slightly flat. He had scraped palms and knees and smelled like someone who had been somewhere wet. He told his mother, in the kind of voice reserved for telling you about a dream you won't remember, that he had walked there because the outside wanted to be the inside. They said the street was soft and would let me through, he told them, and then, in a child's attempt at neatness, added that the other children were okay and they had been humming the right song. The boy's return offered reprieve and unease in equal measure. The police closed the report with a shrug of administrative satisfaction. Child found, unharmed, returning road. But Mateo's eyes had taken on a depth children do not usually carry. They looked as if someone had slipped a small notch into them, a place where the light gathers differently. He began to avoid windows and mirrors and would rock slightly if forced to sit near one. In his drawings, faces had these slight holes again. perfect smiles without the usual aperture for eyes. At the nurse's office, Laya had already been seen more than once. Her insistence that it wants faces had been recorded in notes that smelled faintly of antiseptic and marker pens. The nurse's file contained a line in a cramped hand. Child insists mirror moves on its own. Tape applied. Calmed after warm drink. Laya had drawn circles in the margins of the intake forms and used up the office stickers. She told the nurse she had met a girl who folded her hands like a napkin inside the glass, pleasing, friendly, but her lip twitched when she said it, and she pressed both palms to her chest as if keeping something from leaving. Rumors condensed into a story with a repeated refrain. Something on the other side takes features it needs, laughs, pattern, faces, and uses them to make a fragile analog of our children. We called the thing many names: the mimic, the echo, the reflection that learned a language. The city papers loved the word mimic. It suggested causality and intention. The more lettered theories proposed psychological contagion, mass stress reactions, a neurochemical echo coursing through the brains of townspeople already frayed by months of pandemic isolation. These explanations were useful. They allowed people to nod and duck their heads and return to dinner. Yet, Mateo's returned presence complicated the neatness of those theories. He recited a phrase that remained in my head for weeks: "The outside is the other inside." It is a child's image, luminous, wrong, understructured, and it meant something worrisome, a permeability between spaces we had thought secure. People began to talk of thresholds differently. We labeled doorways again, as if the act of speech could make the line thicker. At a parent meeting, the superintendent read a statement from a crisp piece of stationery. It would be circulated and later uploaded to the school website. Superintendent, Bulletin. We understand the community's concerns regarding recent events. The school is cooperating fully with authorities. Additional security measures have been implemented. Please review attached safety protocols. Counseling resources are available. We ask the community to refrain from speculation and to direct any tips to the school hotline. Thank you for your continued trust. The official voice is necessary and gentle in its way, but it does not soothe mothers who watch their children finger the edges of doors and ask, "What if it wants my face?" We wanted a knob to turn. We wanted an authority to close the shutters. A police report, redacted for distribution, contained a line that read differently when you let your eyes rest on it. Witness reports of masked figure. Multiple eyewitness statements describing humming. The detective underlined that no suspicious person matching the mask description was found on school grounds overnight. He wrote, "Possible psychological contagion. Follow-up with social services recommended." The language of reports is both pillow and blade, soft in tone, keen in implication. The town's pastor, an earnest man who ran a blue minivan and delivered muffins to the teachers on Fridays, used the church's loudspeaker to offer a different framing. In the recording, a clip that was later shared during a vigil, he spoke into a microphone with his palms open. "Pastor, we do not know all the reasons for the fear that touches our children. We do know how to stand together. Light your porch. Keep your promises. Listen to the child who speaks a different song. Pray, if that is your place. Bring casseroles. Check in on your neighbor. Do not let rumor be a stranger you invite for tea." His words soothed like warm clothes, and for some, they worked. For others, they felt like the wrong instrument for a problem that hummed in the guts of windows. We needed more than platitudes. We needed a narrative that could encompass smell and timbre, the precise way a child hums a wrong note into a pillow. People grew inventive. A group of parents organized a watch rota. Another cluster stitched up boundary kits.
Small pouches with a flashlight, a strip of painter's tape, and a laminated card printed with the phrase, "Not you, not tonight." Children carried these kits like talismans. We taught them the words and practiced voice tone, as if training a gentle dialect for survival. The kits gave us a sense of agency. We valued small gestures because they are what we can control.
But even rituals have limits. In the nurse's office, Mateo pressed his face to the window and described a place lit the wrong way, a hallway heading inward. He said there were children there who did not look like ours. They asked me if I wanted to trade smiles, he told his mother, pulling at a loose thread on her sleeve. She pressed his face and smelled the dust on him, a mother's gesture of proof. After his return, the town held an impromptu vigil at the riverside. Lanterns in a line, parents holding hands, kids in pajamas with stuffed animals tucked under their arms. We listened to the hush of the river and tried to embody stillness. The pastor read from memory, "Let us be a light unto one another." There was a buoyant moment where community felt like scaffolding and not like rhetoric. People offered casseroles, people cried, people made lists. One of the lists I kept, on a slip of paper that I still have folded in my wallet, reads like this, in my handwriting. Tape mirrors. Keep lights on. Do not let children play alone by windows. Stick to groups. Call if anything seems off. It is banal in tone, but heavy in consequence. The language of lists pulls fear into the manageable. Intermittent vignettes from the town proliferated in the days following Mateo. A teacher who kept a window seat said her reflection blinked too soon. A neighbor swore their fish tank bubbler synced with the tune. A grocery store cashier insisted a slice of pizza in the break room started to hum. These are the small comic asides that punctuate the longer grief. We use humor to thin the density of dread. But humor did not last long around these matters. The small, private rituals remained. Climax. The corridor. Everything accumulated like sediment until one evening when a corridor in the old wing became the site of a theater-sized decision. A place where ordinary muscles would either keep a child or hand him over. The corridor was narrow and smelled of old varnish and chalk dust. A limbo between classrooms, lined with low cubbies and children's art wrapped in lamination. It was the sort of adult passage you pass through without thinking. That night, it became a stage. We had convened because the city had sent a message. Increased reports of masked figures near windows during brief lockdowns. The school was running an extra check. I had gone to pick up Ethan because the administration had requested parents collect their children if able. When I reached the corridor, it was full of bodies. Teachers, parents, a line of small faces with big eyes. Masks glinted under fluorescent lights. There were whispers like dried leaves. Ethan was small in my arms, his face warm, his hair curled damp from a head of salt and sand play earlier that day. He hummed his 2 notes into his elbow as if that would tuck him away. I held him close as if proximity were a legal instrument. I carried him like a person transporting a hot, fragile thing from one place to another. My knees were tired, and my voice had been taxed by days of explanations and the peculiar exhaustion of grief that is not yet named. The masked figure stood at the end of the corridor, half in shadow, a smooth white face that denied detail like a hand that refuses shaking. It did not move forward at first. Instead, it placed 2 palms against the glass of the window that looked down onto the courtyard. Its hands were human-shaped and still. A few children watched it with the strange calm of the hypnotized. A teacher crossed herself in a small, private motion. "Bring him over," said a voice I recognized as one used for authority on such nights. The voice of someone who had decided that protocols were the map we would follow. A teacher, younger than me, stepped forward with the group, and in that moment made the choice that many in her role make. She trusted institutional direction over instinct, perhaps convinced it would be less expensive in emotional labor to comply. I saw the teacher reach for Ethan by the edge of my pocket, hands professional and practiced.
I do not know if, in that instant, it was my body that moved or some internal thing that mapped pressure and answered with movement. I stepped between them. I do not mean to dramatize. I simply put my limbs where the teacher's hands wanted to be, and Ethan pressed his small cheek against my collarbone. The masked figure, white and impossible, turned its head as if to read the scene like a page. "Give him here," the teacher said, soft but insistent. She did not want to make a scene. Her voice had the gentle authority of someone trained to keep order. In every situation, there are scripts. The teacher read hers. The corridor breathed in the hush of expectation. I said, "No." That is such a simple verb and such an awkward one when everything is at stake. I said it like a hinge closing. I felt the room condense around the syllable. The teacher tried again. "Protocols, we need to." The masked figure's head inclined, as if listening to the voices in the corridor, as if they belonged to a choir, and each voice could be plucked for a note. Something shifted then. The masked figure lifted one hand from the glass, and with the grace of a thing that has been practicing imitation, mimed the action of reaching for Ethan. It did not speak. It could not. It only made the movement. My body unrolled a muscle response that felt ancient and animal. I stepped closer and put my palm on Ethan's small nape. He smelled like crayons and peaches. I pressed him further into myself, the way you might press a folded letter into a safe. I said to the adult teacher, "You're not taking him." Behind me, a small chorus of parents had frozen, and in their faces I read the arithmetic of possibility, handing over a child and watching them be given up to the mimic, or letting a mother decide with her instincts. The conductor of bureaucracy, a man in a jacket that read as authority but not tenderness, insisted that everyone remain calm and that we must allow checks to proceed. He was the kind of person who lives for the clarity of policy. The masked figure lifted both hands then and let out a sound. It was the wrongness of the whistling reworked into exhalation. The sound threaded through the fluorescent air and made the light seem thinner. In that moment, it felt older than me and yet young enough to be learning what a child's protest sounds like. Ethan, who until then had been hummed and small, suddenly wrenched his head back and blurted one word in a child's hot voice, "Not you." He did not know the ritual we taught him. He had chosen his own. The masked figure recoiled as if physically struck. It caught for a beat in the no space between being and not being, and then it moved away, not running, but receding as tide does. Teachers wept afterward, not for a rescue, but for the extremity that had required their hearts to beat like that. The man in the jacket wrote a note into his pad that read, "Maternal intervention prevented transfer of child." He used a tone of clinical record to name what had happened. I think of that corridor as the place the town learned the measure of a mother's hands. There are other mothers who would have made different choices, and probably good ones. I do not pretend my decision was heroic in some cinematic way. I only know that my fingers were braced like nails and that my heart refused the calculus of handing over a child to something that was practiced at imitation. After the corridor, the masked figure no longer chose to step into the hallways. The night guard reported seeing it at the periphery, standing still near the leaf-swept entrance, its white face reflective of the porch light. On the security log, a clinician wrote, "Entity withdrew after close maternal proximity." The language had the shabbiness of people reaching for vocabulary that would fit. Aftermath and rituals. A town that has learned a new name for fear becomes busy in unfamiliar tasks, covering, lighting, mumbling, counting. Maplewood turned its hands to rituals like a congregation polishing a relic. We invented customs that both protected and simplified our lives. We made lists, we taped, we taught phrases. I kept in a notebook the size of my palm a ledger of what we did. I do not mean this as a boast. I mean it as a record of small things that stitch the days. The book contains entries like, Painter's tape on the bathroom mirror, horizontal strip across the top third. Nightlight taped with clear film under the plastic lens. Porch light left on until 2 a.m. Weekly schedule. Ethan taught phrase, "Not you, not tonight." Practice twice a day. Doorways reinforced with chain locks. Ritual. Before bedtime, say 3 things you liked about your day. Keeps mouth busy, children told us.
These rituals were tiny acts of magic because they had consequences of psychology. They anchored children's thinking. They provided patterns for shaky nervous systems. They gave parents something to do that did not feel helpless. Community vignettes proliferated. A neighbor named Tom left out a box of small torches with batteries in the town square and taped a note to it, "For anyone who needs a light." A teacher named Marisol taught her class a mirror song that was a single line of melody designed to break any echo. It goes 1, 2, 3, and then we're free. A nonsense line sung in the same tone every time a child approached glass. The song had the calming property of habit. In the teacher's report, she called it a behavioral interrupt. The church organized a watch team that took turns walking the perimeter on Thursdays, 2 by 2. They carried coffee and argued about theology and never once caught anything more than a raccoon. The PTO hosted a session with a child psychologist who gave parents a list of grounding techniques and stress management strategies for children with sudden startle responses. The psychologist's voice was clear and practical. We clung to such clarity. There were also less formal rituals. A neighborhood woman that I'd known since scrapbooks, Ruth, kept a small ceramic bell on her windowsill. When she worried, she would toll it once and think of the hollow sound as a bell rather than a laugh. It comforted her without defining the problem. Another family started leaving small strings of fairy lights in their windows, declaring it a Bright Neighbor initiative. Children delighted in the lights and began to police them like badges. Yet the rituals had an underside. They taught us to be permanently alert. They formed a set of habits that curved around the edges of our days. Parents began to sleep with lamps on, living rooms staged like surveillance rooms. We started living with the notion that being forever prepared is both a virtue and a wound. When a kid said hush hush in a grocery aisle and a stranger glanced at a parent, we knew what the look meant. The look of someone measuring whether vigilance is worth the cost. The town's rumor mill also spawned artifacts that collected like ephemera in my phone. There were forwarded emails, thank you notes from the superintendent, advice from a community therapist, a neighborhood forum post that read like this: Maplewood Forum Post, Anonymous. Has anyone else found their appliances whistling? My microwave chirped at 2 a.m. like a little song. I am not making this up. My son looked at the microwave and said, "It's singing the wrong song." Someone else replied, "We've been taping our bathroom mirrors. It's silly, but it helps the kids. We also sing the mirror song. We are making a town of tiny rituals." Another reply, "Someone posted a photo of the dressing room before it was fully taped." A parent wrote, "I deleted the photo. I couldn't stand to see it." The town's rumor mill also spawned artifacts that collected like ephemera in my phone. There were forwarded emails, thank you notes from the superintendent, advice from a community therapist, a neighborhood forum post that read like this: Maplewood Forum Post, Anonymous. Has anyone else found their appliances whistling? My microwave chirped at 2 a.m. like a little song. I am not making this up. My son looked at the microwave and said, "It's singing the wrong song." Someone else replied, "We've been taping our bathroom mirrors. It's silly, but it helps the kids. We also sing the mirror song. We are making a town of tiny rituals." Another reply, "Someone posted a photo of the dressing room before it was fully taped." A parent wrote, "I deleted the photo. I couldn't stand to see it."
Another poster, "It's only kids. It's only sound." But the last comment read, "Keep your porch lights on. We might be small, but we're not alone." An image went viral for a scant day, a grainy, slightly overexposed school photograph that showed a line of children standing for picture day.
In the background, slightly to the left, a smear or a face or the suggestion of a face stood in the window like a memory. The caption read, "Who is that in the window?" The comments went from nostalgic to anxious in a tide. Some teased that it was a janitor's ghost. Others speculated on camera defects. Others wrote quietly that they wished cameras could be blunted like knives. The photograph did more than provoke. It made private worry public, and once made public, worry becomes another citizen to feed. The town's memory practices began to mature. We held a communal meeting in the high school auditorium that turned into a vigil. People brought candles and macaroni salads. The pastor read a list of children's names and asked us to light a little candle for each. The room hummed like a hive, a gathering of small nerves. We did not decide anything that night except to stay around one another. A small team of parents created a document called the Maplewood Guidelines, which collected the plausible do's and don'ts, a combination of policy and home practice. It had sections for schools, for aftercare, for playground maintenance, and for parental vigilance. It was long and dense and comforting in the sense that making a document is an act of hope. We circulated it like a shield. There were nights when all of this felt like theater, when I would gently tuck Ethan into bed and tape his nightlight and half laugh at my own seriousness. He would listen and take the acts like a feasibility project. Sometimes he would sleep heavy and ordinary and then wake up humming a fraction of a wrong note, and my throat would fill with a salt that felt like loss redeemed into care. Months became a pliant thing. We adapted. The janitor was never again a presence in the town's gossip in the same way. He continued his rounds and seemed, to all outward evidence, to be a person who loved routine. The merry-go-round did not spin in the same way, and eventually was fenced. Mirrors remained at risk of being papered for a long time. Children learned their rhymes, parents learned the weight of ritual. For a while, Maplewood thrummed like a body that has survived a fever. We were scarred and functioning. We folded the strange into our calendar like a holiday that nobody wanted to celebrate. Hush, hush, that thin note no longer had the same power to make the night tilt. Epilogue, coda. Years passed like other people's children. Ethan grew a few inches, then more, until his legs were longer than mine, and his voice decided to deepen in some rooms and remain small in others. He retained, as most children do, quirked habits.
He still hummed the two notes when he was concentrating. He still avoided standing by an empty mirror for too long. But he learned to ride a bike and to tell a joke with a timing that pleased him. The ritual softened over time into stories told at dinner parties in that slightly embarrassed way parents talk about the things they survived. Maplewood spun its stories into a local lore that read like a parable. On warm nights at the diner, someone would mention the summer of tune and mirror in motion. We told the stories with the benefit of time, with embellishments that made us look brave or foolish in equal measure. Children who had been seeds in the town during that season, now teenagers, developed an economy of references. A phrase, a look, a half-hum passed between them in lockers that made adults glance up and want to be in on the joke. There are vestiges that persist. My nightlight still has a strip of painter's tape beneath it, though I know now, rationally, it does nothing to stop anything but my anxiety. I do not remove it because habit is a kind of prayer. Sometimes when Ethan is packing for school, he will take the tape off, consider it like someone contemplating a small sacrament, and reapply it with the solemn ease of a child who remembers being small and the sound in his ears. On graduation day, my son wore a shirt he chose for reasons I could not fully parse. Later, he hummed our two-note line as he walked across the lawn. And when the band started, it washed away like any child's small signal in the background noise of adulthood. He laughed then at something a friend said, and for an instant the wrong lullaby threaded the air. I felt the familiar prickle of watchfulness, and then a soft relief, that he had found the true rhythm of his life. Maplewood is not a town that believes in clear endings. Our story is a palimpsest, damage, repair, a faint echo beneath the new layer. The civic rituals, the taped mirrors, the porch lights left on, the occasional vigil, remain part of our landscape. People have names for the lessons. Be careful, watch over one another, make small ceremonies that hold larger truths. We teach our children phrases that might protect them and habits that might not, but that let us sleep. I keep some of the artifacts. A still photo of the merry-go-round blurred in dusk. A printed copy of the corridor footage with a faint smear where something seems to have altered the grain. A small card with "Not you, not tonight" written in my own hand. I place them in a drawer like a person might keep postcards from places that changed them. Once, months after the last recorded incident the town had bothered to log, Ethan came home and placed a pebbled stone on the kitchen table. It was ordinary, a weathered river rock with a pale vein. He set it down and said, "We should leave it near the porch light." When I asked why, he shrugged, that adolescent mingling of care and disdain, and said simply, "In case something comes to the other side and wants our inside, it should see something bright." We laughed. We joked about the theatrics of it. Then I did as he suggested and put the stone near the lamp on the porch step. It was a small compliance and felt like a courtesy extended to a possibility we did not entirely refuse to imagine. That is how vigilance often works, not as heroics, but as courtesy. When I watch Ethan sleep now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night and hear a tune in the refrigerator or a kettle. I listen to see whether it is the old wrong song or one of the 100 domestic noises that have learned to harmonize with living. Sometimes the hum is nothing. Sometimes it is a neighbor's wind chime. Occasionally and rarely, a fragment of that whistle folds into the hush and I feel the old color rise in my face. I remind myself of the corridor and the decision I made in the fluorescent air. I remember the miracle that was not a miracle. A child's small resistance, my hands, the way the masked figure receded. Maplewood keeps telling its tale in hushed tones at potlucks and PTA meetings, in the way the parish newsletter mentions the anniversary of the vigil without making a spectacle. It's a story we slide into our pockets to tell new neighbors, a story that binds us in the cautious intimacy of shared survival. If you've made it this far, and this kind of quiet, lingering dread is something you come back for, tell me in the comments if your town ever had a night that bent the rules. If the story stayed with you, consider liking and subscribing for more small tales that live in the margins of everyday life. We tell each other these stories because they remind us we are not alone in holding the light. The last image I carry is not dramatic. It is of Ethan one evening years later, on a slow walk home with a backpack sagging with books, humming his 2 notes in a casual, contented way, as if testing the timbre of his voice against the air. We paused by a window that caught his reflection a blink late. He glanced, met his own eyes, and then pushed off with a laugh that belonged entirely to him. I thought, we had kept him, at least for now. The world had been blunted by watchfulness, not fixed. The hum remained a memory, a neighbor to a life that continued. That is enough for now.